Let's start from the bottom and work up. The Kursk incursion is largely at an end. Most of the people that went into Russia, and some of them unfortunately included Americans in Ukrainian uniform, along with some Poles. There may have also been some Brits involved. They're virtually all dead, and there's not much left to it at this stage of the game. The Russians are in the business of cleanup, not only in Kursk, but up and down the line of contact. And again, as we've said so often in the past, President Putin has made it clear that he does not want to rule Ukrainians. So we've now moved beyond the traditionally Russian areas where you have Russian speakers into areas that were historically Ukrainian. He's not very excited about that. He would rather not do that. But he's going to press slowly but surely further and further towards the Dnieper River, because he knows that in Europe, the appetite for this whole thing is gone. Regardless of what Scholz has said or has done recently, the Germans aren't sending any more material help to the Ukrainians. They regard this as a lost war. Macron certainly understands that. I think that's widely understood in Europe. The problem is that they're waiting for Washington to stand up and acknowledge reality. Nobody in Washington right now is ready to do that. And that's one of the reasons that I think President Trump's strength is growing, because people, not just here in the United States, but around the world, want an end to this thing. They recognize how potentially dangerous it is. And so as a result, I think they're waiting for President Trump to arrive on the scene, assuming that he wins the election. So many times we treat international law with complete contempt. And then we excoriate anybody who does something we don't like as violating the so-called rules-based order, which really means challenges our military and financial hegemony in the world. We've had Americans on the ground in Ukraine doing all sorts of things in and out of uniform for a very long time. We know that other NATO members had people involved with this Kursk operation. At one point, it was described as the baby of the SACEUR, the Supreme Commander Europe. And they said it's the Cavoli plan. I don't know whether or not that was true, but that's what was kicked around at very high levels. So we've all been involved in this thing. And at some point when this tragedy ends, we're going to discover just how many people were actually killed who were from NATO countries and from the United States. But right now, all we can do is speculate, because those facts just aren't available to us. You might see, certainly not combat troops under any circumstances, but you might see some North Koreans that have been involved in fortifications or defensive measures along the line of contact, but not in combat. I would just rule that out completely. The Russians don't need the help. Part of the reason people mention these things is to convey the utterly false perception that Russia is in trouble, that Russia doesn't have enough men or doesn't have enough troops. It's all nonsense. The Russians can't take all the volunteers that want to fight. Just stop and consider that for a minute. Whenever the Hezbollah has struck targets, it's tried to hit military targets. And it is alarming to the Israelis that something could get through what they consider to be their air and missile defense system. And the fact that they killed these young men strikes at home. Everyone in Israel, whenever someone is killed, everyone in Israel feels the pain. And the fact that so many were wounded is very frightening. I don't know if you noticed it, but a few weeks ago, we watched Mr. Netanyahu deliver a speech in the aftermath of the Iranian counterstrike, where they fired 180 missiles and basically gave a demonstration of precision strike, their ability to hit targets. And they only killed one or two people, and that was by design. They weren't interested in killing large numbers of people. They were trying to signal that we have the capability to penetrate your air defenses. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is that his hands were literally shaking as he read his remarks.
Right.
I think there is real fear and concern at the top of the Israeli leadership right now, because Hezbollah has control of not only information, but access to their airspace. They've been flying unmanned aircraft, we call them drones, for a long time. They know where virtually everything is. The Iranians certainly do. There are no secrets left, which means that no base inside Israel is really safe any longer. That's what's most frightening. And if you can attack an Israeli military concentration like that, what does that mean for the thousands and thousands of Israelis who want to go back to their homes in northern Israel? They're not going back anytime soon. That's pretty damn clear. First of all, there are lists of all the things: power plants, water purification sites, as well as oil production facilities, is Iranian bases, particularly for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Remember, just as I pointed out that Hezbollah in Iran know pretty much where everything is in Israel, Israel knows where everything is in Iran. So this is the age of persistent surveillance. There is not much that you can do without being detected, especially if you have any sort of electronic or thermal signature. So there are a lot of places they can strike and do very serious harm. We have been preeminently concerned about the impact, obviously, on global markets of an attack on oil facilities, especially Karg Island. At the same time, we're also very concerned about any attempt to penetrate the mountain where, the Iranian nuclear facilities are located, because they're hundreds of feet beneath the surface. And most experts have concluded that the potential to penetrate hundreds of feet below the surface is not very good. You can go a certain distance, perhaps 100 feet, 200 feet, but much beyond that, it's very, very difficult. So there's a hope that that will not happen. And then finally, hovering in the background, you have this fear of an Iranian nuclear capability, that they could rapidly transform their existing stocks of enriched uranium or plutonium into warheads, which I think is probably real at this point. If you didn't want Iran to, quote unquote, get the bomb, then you shouldn't have done what you've been doing for years, which is threatening and bullying and pushing Iran. So I think that's also in the background. But the bottom line is this, and this is what people in the United States really need to understand. In the South, Hamas is alive. Has it been damaged? Of course. Is it being annihilated? No. In the North, you have Hezbollah. Has it been damaged? Of course. Is it annihilated? Absolutely not. So effectively, the Israeli Defense Force has failed in those two areas. They haven't been able to bring those areas under control. Right now, if you turn on Israeli television, officers are talking about, we may go a kilometer or two, or maybe 3 or 4 kilometers into southern Lebanon, but we're not going to drive to the Litani River as we have in the past. We can't do it. So you've got something of a stalemate, which from the standpoint of Hezbollah and Hamas is a victory. For the Israelis, it's tantamount to defeat. And in the midst of this, you have the prime minister who has now stated publicly he will attack whatever he thinks should be attacked in Iran, regardless of what we want or do not want. And you'll remember that over the weekend, there was a piece, I think it was in the Washington Post. I could be wrong. It might have been in the New York Times, where the journalist asserted that Mr. Netanyahu might conceivably be looking for an off-ramp. In other words, a willingness to step back from the maximalist objectives, and therefore the next Israeli strike on Iran would not be, everything that Israel has to offer. In fact, it would be scaled back. Well, since then, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, I don't know where this information came from, but that's absolutely false. And then, of course, we've had these leaks in the press where we've leaked deliberately, I guess, the discussions that we've had with the Iranians about asking them to exercise restraint. These things are completely damaging. So right now, I would say that both sides, Iran and Israel, have no interest in exercising much restraint. They may hold back behind the nuclear threshold, but everything else is fair game. And I think the Israelis will throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at Iran when the time comes. That's where we stand. And this is a last-ditch effort, Judge. Mr. Netanyahu doesn't have very many good cards to play. He's got thousands of American servicemen and women sitting on ships in the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean. We can't keep them there in perpetuity. The Navy is literally cannibalizing itself to continue to operate with some measure of effectiveness as it is. Our armed forces are not in particularly good shape. Our missile inventories are low. And remember, you got to go back into port in most cases to rearm. So when we get involved in anything, we have a fairly short burst of capability, go back and reload, and then return to the launch site at sea. These are things that Mr. Netanyahu knows. That's one of the reasons that the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System was deployed to Israel. It's one of the best things that we have ever produced. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you set that radar up in Washington, D.C. somewhere, and you point it towards the south, you can track a basketball at 500 feet above the ground in New Orleans. Think about that. That's the kind of resolution this radar provides. The reason I'm emphasizing that is that the missiles, we may exhaust the missiles that we've sent very quickly because you fire 2 or 3 missiles at every incoming target. But the radar is key because the radar can cue large numbers of systems all over Israel to focus on where the enemy is coming. And that's very, very important. So this radar is the crown jewel of what we have to offer right now in air and missile defense, and he's got it on the ground. The problem, of course, is the Iranians are aware of what I've just said, and it'll be a very lucrative target when the fighting begins. Israel is going to have a tough time. Let's be frank. I'm sure your other guests have told you similar things. The Iranians are capable of leveling large parts of Israel. There is no question about it. That's why it makes no sense from Mr. Netanyahu's standpoint to withhold anything from his attack on Iran, because he'll try to destroy as much as possible of Iran's capability to threaten and destroy him. It's only natural. I don't think he's going to be very successful, but we'll see. He has the advantage of our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, space-based and otherwise, and I think that will help enormously. But will it be enough to prevent the arrival of large numbers of hypersonic missiles and ballistic missiles on target in Israel? And that I can't answer, but I think it's going to be very difficult for Israel. A good friend with a lot of years of experience inside the intelligence community said it very well to me. He said, when the time comes and Mr. Netanyahu wants something from the United States in the event of the next attack with Iran, he's not going to ask for anything. He will simply make demands, and we will meet those demands. I think we have to understand that this is very much a case of the tail wagging the dog. Here you have a nation of, at least when this began, of a little over 7 million Jewish Israelis, plus another million Arabs that are living inside Israel's borders. I mean, the current borders, not including Gaza and the West Bank.
Right.
And we are a nation of what? 330, 340 million. And we are now hostage to whatever Mr. Netanyahu decides to do. Those are the facts. He's in control. He's been in control from the very beginning. And while he has control, I think he's going to use it, because there is no guarantee after the November election that he'll be able to do then what he's doing now. I know that a lot of people are saying, well, President Trump will give him whatever he wants. But if I were Mr. Netanyahu, I'm not sure that I would buy that argument. I think I would probably act now. And that's his best bet of dragging us into something. And again, if you look at this Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System and its radar, the roughly 100 American soldiers that are part of this, a lot of people are treating this as some sort of tripwire. Well, the truth is we've already got tripwires. We have those things in Iraq and Syria. And when President Trump was in office, he wanted to get our soldiers out of those places precisely because we could not defend them in the event of a high-end conventional conflict, which is what we're looking at with Iran and Israel. The Terminal High Altitude Air Defense is not necessarily a tripwire, but it does signal that we will probably lose soldiers on the ground in Israel, on Israeli soil, if this fight continues. His hope that that will be enough to trigger all-out war between the United States and Iran. But I'm not sure that that would necessarily happen. We have fought for almost 30 years very weak, incapable opponents. Those days are over. We now face not only Iran, but potentially Russia. There are thousands of Russian technical military personnel inside Iran. There are Russian pilots capable of flying aircraft in defense of Iran. People may have forgotten, but back during the Vietnam War and certainly during the Korean War, there were Russian pilots, in those days Soviet pilots, that flew aircraft, particularly in Korea, and were very effective. What I'm trying to say is that people in Washington, particularly in the administration and the White House, are afraid of being dragged into an all-out war. They don't want that. The problem is that right now they're hostage to Netanyahu. Netanyahu is going to do whatever he wants to do, and he wants to get us into the war. So if we were to lose these soldiers, there would be an attempt by the administration to strike back, but there would also be an attempt to rein in that strike. In other words, we don't want an all-out war with Iran that could bring us into confrontation with Russia. We've already lost the war in Ukraine. Even though nobody talks about it, it's a blatant disaster. Over the weekend, I had several people who are over on the ground in Ukraine telling me that the numbers of deaths of Ukrainian soldiers far exceed 600,000. They've talked about 1.5 million casualties. Now, I don't know, but it's a disaster. Ukraine is in ruins. We've lost. Our equipment has failed. Everything we've done has failed. Do we want to relive this experience in the Middle East? I don't think anybody in the White House wants to. And so I just think we want to avoid something that is now looking more and more inevitable. Well, I don't think they're fighting with UNIFIL. UNIFIL is not there to fight anybody, as we know. And by the way, the incidents that we've seen thus far involving Irish troops that happen to be part of that organization, the Irish soldiers have behaved with commendable restraint. You don't want hotheads running the show in CENTCOM, and we certainly don't want a war with Russia and Iran. That's the point. That's why let us assume that some American soldiers are killed. Do we instantly commit the entire United States, all 340 million people, our scientific industrial base and the armed forces, to all-out war? I don't think so. And I think that I'm sure that the CENTCOM commander has received some very specific orders on that score. Professional soldiers, especially their officers, are expected to exercise restraint and control over their emotions. And however angry they may be, they understand the consequences of their actions. And no one wants this war. Mr. Netanyahu does, but we certainly do not. The Europeans are not really capable of very much. And I certainly understand the sentiments expressed by Mr. Macron, but he's very unlikely to become involved in a direct confrontation with the Israelis. If anything, he's probably had back channels from us telling him to butt out, which I suspect he will probably do. The Israelis are riding high in the saddle. And by that, I mean the arrogance and the self-confidence that arrogance sometimes breeds is out of control. If you watch Israeli television, when the people are discussing in panel settings what's happening, there is no sense of the casualties that have been taken already in Gaza or in South Lebanon. There's no sense that Israel could lose, none whatsoever. Their news is as carefully predigested and disseminated as our own. So the real question, which is what you began this with, was, will Israel survive it? You and I and others who are looking at this and hopefully looking at it objectively are sensing that it might not. But that thought is completely absent from the Israeli public and from the minds of its senior leaders. Now, it may be that in private, Mr. Netanyahu and Gallant and others who are in the cabinet know differently and feel differently. But the thing is, if that's true, what do? If you step back, if you back down, who is going to negotiate with you? Hezbollah? Hamas? Any of the Arab states? Remember, you began this campaign by saying everyone was Amalek, an animal, subhuman, who deserved to be destroyed. People say, well, we meant the people in Gaza. No, you said that about Arabs.
Right.
And everyone in the region translates that into not just Arabs, but also Muslims and Christians and whatever else might be there. So who are you going to negotiate with if you back down? There's no one to negotiate with. Are we going to have any leverage with any of these countries at this point? No. The truth is not very popular here with American media, or certainly in Israel, or for that matter, in Ukraine as regards the truth. And from the vantage point of the Israelis, for a Jew to want to report truthfully on what's happening inside Israel, that's a form of treason. And so they're completely unsympathetic. Now, when you move it up to the State Department level, the question that you're answering is another question that you've asked before. Who's in charge? We know who's in charge. Mr. Netanyahu is in charge. And we have to look at our government and understand that his agents, his supporters, are in positions of authority. And they are going to do what he says. It's that simple. Remember the word Amalek. If you characterize your opponent as something less than human, it makes it much easier to kill the opponent. And I'm afraid that Mr. Netanyahu and his friends in the cabinet have tried to turn this into what it's effectively become, which is a ruthless war of extermination against not just the people of Gaza, but all of their enemies in the region. And they feel strongly that they have every right to dispose of them, and they will use whatever means are necessary, including us. And we are seen as their obedient servants. It's that simple. I don't know that you need a more sophisticated assessment than that. And it's tragic